Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing a weekly reads wrap-up for the first week of December, which has come on, well, kind of like March, like a lion. So soon, I wonder what my reading weeks will be like because I'll have family in, so we'll see. I might just drop off to only a couple books a week. I don't know. The first book that I read was Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurian, and this is a commercial fiction thriller book with an interesting setup. It has a first-person point of view of a person who's not neurotypical, who doesn't experience empathy, and we learn that she is part of an experiment at a campus college, I believe, where a number of these people are put there as a sort of experiment. I think the goal is to show that these people can function. Unfortunately, I did not finish this book, so I can't speak too much about it. I completed 25% of the book via audio, which was narrated fine. But despite it having that pretty interesting setup, the plot just didn't go places that were interesting. But in general, I would say my tastes don't lean towards the commercial fiction as much these days, so take it with a grain of salt. Next, I read Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. 4 stars out of 5. Excellent. I found this very compelling and ironically a little bit funny, which I have usually said if a book is funny, I will probably DNF it. It doesn't usually generate any resonance. The comedic timing is off. Me generating the humor within my own head typically doesn't work. But this book, I think specifically because I paired it with an audiobook, the voice is so unique that when I heard it on audio done well, excellently, I would say the narration is phenomenal. You can't hear the voice any other way. It's done so well. And when that was implanted in my brain, even when I was reading it in a physical format, it really resonated with me. The jokes and the cadence and the sort of spirit in which everything is delivered is quite good. This is about a boy who is born at the same time of the independence of India, and he finds as he grows up, he has a connection to the Midnight Children, everyone who was born at that time. And it's about Indian history to a certain extent, the growth of the country as sort of paralleling the trajectory of the children, but specifically this one boy. It is, I wouldn't call it magical realism because magic isn't happening all the time. But it's definitely surrealistic. It's definitely having fantastical elements. Some of the Midnight Children have fantastical powers, as we find our own protagonist does. I won't say too much about that because it could be considered a spoiler. I'm not sure if it's in the blurb or not. But either way, he thinks he's very special, very unique. And in the same way that a mother dotes on a boy and sort of puffs up his ego and his importance, and similarly to the people running the institutions of India, I would argue, there is a narcissistic center to the book that is somehow pulled off when maybe it shouldn't have been, or easily could have not have been in a hands of a more inexperienced writer perhaps. But I thought it was great. I did think it meandered somewhat, and I think that you liking this story will be predicated on whether or not you like the voice doing its own thing, and you're either going to like it or you won't. It definitely is satirizing elements of India. It's definitely critical of some aspects. As Jen of Remembered Reads kindly pointed out, she said that he had written pretty critically of Indian history and his book in particular, in which people will mistake these events as verbatim history, sort of like I likened it to the Da Vinci Code, where that book came out and all these people started freaking out and thinking it was real, and Christians were wanted to burn the book and stuff like that. And meanwhile, when you go into Chapters or Indigo, Barnes and Noble or whatever, where do you find the book? In fiction, as with this book. So I think, just exercise some critical thinking and you'll be fine. The ending, I felt, did not quite land for me. It was weird. There's a kind of dissonance where I thought that the end had fit the story quite well, but yet also let me down because it felt like it was building to a bigger moment. And so while it made sense that it was not that moment, I still wanted it. Next, I read The Accident of Being Lost, Songs and Stories by Leanne Simpson. This is the same person that did Nobleming, which was phenomenal. Her same writing style shines through in this memoir that is more about her examining some more toxic aspects of herself and being vulnerable, where she's trying to figure out why she sort of instantly connects to some people, flocks to people that aren't good to her, and her overall relationship with everybody else, which feels very different in a colonizee type of way. The mentality of the way white people interact and the way that she does. She goes into some institutional things, but not too many. For instance, taxes, which relatable. So it's a very eclectic range of topics, very stream of consciousness. And I did enjoy it. I gave it 3 stars, but it is not really what I am looking for from her. I'm much more interested in her fiction, I found out from reading it. Then I read The Honjin Murders, Detective #1 by Seishi Yokomizo. I did not like this book. I gave it 2 stars, but let me tell you about it because I think a lot of people would like it. The method and the solution of this book, which is a locked room mystery, it feels like almost a Deus Ex Machina, except that it's for murder. So this book is about a couple who get married. They are somewhat controversial in the manner of lots of detective murder / stuff. There's a sort of reason for the entire family to be mad that this event is occurring. The woman is not of great stock, and they are very concerned with lineage, and so they're angry that he's marrying for love, essentially. But the event actually goes fine. In the middle of the night, there's a scream. They find the 2 of them both dead, locked in a room, of course, and the solution is completely opaque to the the normal detective, I guess. That's a provincial one. And one of the guests, the uncle, he is a personal friend with this detective, which this book introduces for the first time. And this guy shows up and basically, readily figures it out. He's essentially a Sherlock person. It's very reasoning and hyper awareness of a number of different events, schedules, esoteric information that he puts together in order to solve it, almost not immediately, but it's fairly quickly. And then he does a showmanship thing where it all comes together. So in terms of all that, I've kind of seen it all before, so it didn't surprise me or interest me that much. The actual solution is quite interesting, but you need to go into this thinking that your suspension of disbelief needs to be heightened more so than with normal, realistic detective stuff, because I found it slightly contrived, though fun, and very meta in a weird way. We start off as a sort of Watson type person who has learned about this mystery and is ostensibly a mystery writer and goes around looking for stories like this. And he actually surveys the grounds in the future and describes the dilapidated state of things. Overall, it was interesting and almost postmodernish in the way that he constantly enters the fiction. he'll put forward eyewitness testimony, but he'll summarize it as well. So it's not verbatim, and it is very much concerned with maintaining a certain pace, even though I would describe the pace as sort of lackadaisical until the inception of the actual violence occurs. I have the next book in the series, which is the 6th book overall, and because this is very sophomoric, especially in its prose, it might well be a book that I end up quite liking, just because he would have written a bunch of things and, you know, might have refined his process. I also don't know if there's a translation issue with the prose. There's a few times in which the dialogue and the prose work feels stilted and also very odd in its misuse of similes. For instance, there'll be the one thing that stays in my mind frequently as an example is during the murder, the koto is playing and it's like very frenetic and loud, and it's automatopoeia appearing on the page for what it sounds like, but then afterwards it describes what it sounds like. And so it undermines itself continually with the descriptions, as well as when, for instance, there's a sentence where there's a loud thump, which is the thing that I believe wakes up the character to go see what happened. But it says there's a loud thump. There's no pause to sort of make the moment pregnant for the actual reader. Not even like a comma, and then it says like a dividing wall has fallen, but it's not like that wall has fallen. It literally fell. Like it is that thing. So I don't know why they wouldn't describe it as the thing fell. The reader is aware of what the sound is. The character is aware of what the sound of it is, and the sentence itself doesn't make sense. And there's a few moments where that happens, and it's enough to annoy me as somebody who's interested in prose work. So overall, yeah, just go in thinking it's a fun ride instead of being critical, I guess. Next, I read Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. This is the second novel that I've read by her that I thought was middling. I gave it 3 stars. I also read the Hummingbird Lane one, which is also historical China. It was interesting, but the thing that doesn't jibe with me with her is her voice overall. I find it very uninteresting. The things that she is interested in aren't what I want to see in the historical fiction, and she spends a lot of time dwelling in moments that I don't care about. She's particularly concerned with chronicling time in a very granular way, instead of just skipping to the actual events, the drama, the things that I personally want to be seeing, such that the relationship between Snowflower and this woman in 19th century China, where women are wed as property and they're basically colluding, I guess, to find the best match for her. And because she is so restricted from talking to men, from making friends, to basically her entire life is very prescriptive and prescribed by men, she does have this outlet where they allow her to have a pen pal type situation with Snowflower. And so their relationship develops out of these letters, and the letters have a dialect of which only they know. And so it's a private situation, and eventually they form a very deep friendship, but it's convoluted, and it gets, it needs to test time, and various situations of their houses become a conflict, and such that the relationship between them is far more interesting than the actual A-plot, which is bad, I think. It's worth reading and completing it specifically to see how that relationship plays out, and also she is writing from a place in the far future that makes it interesting to the reader to get to that place, to see what all has happened and the changes in her clearly that have happened. I probably won't read another Lisa C. novel just because I don't like her actual authorial voice, but it is not by any means a bad book. Next, I did on audio, My Monticello by Jocelyn, Nicole, Johnson. I gave this 4 stars. I saw this on Bob the Booker's channel. He was pretty fairly high on the book as well. The audio is very well performed. There's numerous cast, one of which I could swear was LeVar Burton. I didn't check, but I'm pretty sure it's him. And it goes into a young person of color who may or may not have heritage going back to Thomas Jefferson, and her sort of wanting to know where she comes from, situate herself in the world. And then it takes, like, maybe not a wild turn, but things get wild where it's dystopian, and that knowledge of her past becomes pertinent in the present and informs her situation. But it does feel like a big change that I didn't really see coming, or maybe I didn't see the first part coming, because the blurb sort of focuses on the latter. And the prose were fantastic. The specificity with human interaction and the diction and the dialogue are quite good. It all felt very organic and natural, and just an entirely pleasant situation to sort of ground yourself in for a while, even though it was dystopian. It definitely is looking at issues of racism, and it's definitely trying to reflect almost like a modern parable of the sower, in which people of color are accurately describing the ways in which white people are interacting with them when society has sort of like crumbled and gone, and they can like do whatever they want, essentially, which is scary and probably triggering for some people, so heads up on that. But it is very good at pointing to not typical reactions of these white people. There's a very chilling moment in which essentially like a white homeless guy thinks that the party of people of color that she's in owe him like food and assistance and stuff like that, because they are the ones who were responsible for like the world and the dystopian and stuff like that ending, because he just assumes that because of their skin they're responsible, and he's projecting his alt-right essential mentality from before the country like imploded and these events are occurring onto them still, and he's essentially making it 100% that he won't get the assistance that he wants from them, but he doesn't understand why, because he assumes that they must help him. So it's quite chilling and very reflective of modern times. I thought it was excellent. Next, I read Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. Gave this 4 stars. It didn't quite have the X factor that I was looking for in terms of voice, but I did like the craft work in it. This is about a pair of twins who are 51-year-old. They live together with their mother in a small rural town in England, but it is not idyllic. It's pretty subversive of the genre in that. And their mother dies, and the pair of twins have to navigate life without their mother, which they find is very different, because she took care of a lot of things, and she also kept a lot of secrets that are now coming out, some of which are fairly wild. It is fairly dramatic. I would say slow burn, slow pace. It sinks into various moments, fairly granular in their lives. So much so that I was having to put it aside when it got into finances. It just really stresses me out now with COVID and my work situation and stuff like that, that they were going so granular into the details of how impoverished that they were, that it kept bringing up feelings about my own situation. And it has a very good sense of interiority for both of them. They're very eclectic, very weird. They're very othered by the townsfolk. The only person each other have is each other now that their mother is gone, and that sort of duality is put to the test with these circumstances. They have to figure out how to bury their mother when they have no money. There's a notion that they owe money to the landlord, despite the fact that their idea of the situation was that the cottage was essentially paid for, and they both sort of spiral inward in a cataclysmic-ish way for each other and themselves because they don't have the tools to negotiate society or this specific situation. The stakes are interesting because ostensibly they're quite low but feel very big, which I quite liked about it. The townsfolk were quite eclectic and ranging in characters and personality, but are also very clearly sort of peripheral devices for confronting very certain aspects of their personality, so I was mixed on that. And overall, I liked it quite a bit. Like I said, it does strangely have a ending that I felt was a little bit incongruent with what was happening throughout the course of the fiction. It was great, it just didn't have the X factor that I was looking for 5 stars. Next is Death on the Nile, Poirot mystery, Agatha Christie. This was fine, I give it 3 stars. I don't think I'll read more Christie and Sherlock and things set in that particular time, probably. In this case, it was a little bit different than what I was particularly expecting, yet still felt trite and predictable. It's still fulfilling in the itch that is scratched when you read these types of stories, though. It's just not something that can exceed my expectations at this point because I've consumed so much of the content of it. I have read 200 or 250 stories like this or whatever. It's very hard for a story like this to exceed my expectations at this point. So next, I read The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay. I love this. This is Michael Chabon. This is my first book that I've read of his as well, so it was I think a very good entry point for me because I like comics. I kind of understood what was happening with the industry. This is about Kavalier and Clay. Both of them are Jewish, both arrive at doing comics for different reasons, but are both engaging in it, in escapism, and the text itself is very concerned with interrogating escapism and providing a fairly balanced review of it, I think, like why people engage in escapism, what its value is, especially in regards to art, and as a mechanism for feeling validated and as a venting and all the reasons people create art really, but are sort of denied the graphic arts and escapism type of books. So it's very interesting, especially through the lens that we're seeing it in the World War and these guys having very complex relationships with their family. Both the families that they form after the fact, which is sort of like a found family aspect, and their actual family that is struggling through Nazism, essentially. Both have very different situations and home lives. Some are one family is able to get out, someone isn't. It's very compelling and very tense, I guess. The narrative tension is always taught. And it's very fun to see the comic book industry, which is very fraught and was very predatory to people creating this escapism art, feel validated in a way that isn't just sort of milquetoast arguments of it's what I liked when I was a kid and I feel very attached to it. This is more of a high level concept attached to a narrative that feels more validating than just a single opinion. It's more of a critical response to that cultural or general intellect looking down on the form, basically, and escapism itself. Even escapism is literally a character codified in the person that they create as a superhero, the escapist. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this book. I absolutely loved it. I don't even know if I completely caught on to all of the aspects of it. I feel like if you were a Jewish person, you would get a lot more of the nuances with the relationships than I did, and I still thought it was great. There is a fantastical element introduced in the form of a well, I just won't say. I think it's probably a spoiler, but there is a fantastical element, and you should know that going in. It is, for the most part, very realistic. Again, it's not magical realism like some people codify it as, because people aren't running around doing magic, and it's not normalized in the setting or anything. It's a fantastical element or a surrealist element. And so go in expecting something realistic, but a little something in the mix, basically. The ending was quite good. It made me think a lot about my expectations as a reader, especially as it pertains to escapist fiction. It's very critical, I think, of the characters. They're very fraught. They're definitely not paragons, though they are trying to essentially write paragons and arguably create that dynamic in pop culture. If it parallels the story of Marvel, which a lot of it does, Stan Lee and Kirby, etc. It feels like a lot of reviewers have been overly critical of the escapism aspect, while not really interacting with it in the spirit of the book, because they have already codified their thoughts on escapism itself, and they don't really allow those two things to communicate or interact. They just simply react to the fact that there's a critical analysis of escapism, and it usually generally comes up as a positive, or at least let people alone that use it. There's genuinely good reasons for people to engage in escapism, and especially in capitalism, especially marginalized people. There's a lot of different reasons that escapism is a thing in society that we engage in, and you can see just from critics in general are very not even critical, they're just crass about entertainment in general. And then the last book that I read was Matrix by Lauren Groff on audio. The audio was exceptional, the narration was very good. It was quite a quick read, actually. It was only 8-hour audiobook, and I think I sped it up to, I don't know, 0.5 or something like that, because it was somewhat of a slow talker, and the immediacy of that actually worked very well with the narrator. It's about I think a famous figure. I don't know anything about history, so every time I go into historical fiction, everyone's like, oh, it's so cool to see, Thomas Cromwell or this person. I'm like, who? So this was a similar situation for me. Maybe you already know this person, but I didn't. This is about Eleanor of Aquitaine, if you know who that is. Deemed too coarse and rough-hewn for marriage or courtly life, she was sent to an abbey at 17 years old, and it charts her course through the abbey and her sort of like feminist awakening and her ways of influencing the abbey and actually the crown, even the land around her, really. It's really interesting in a way that I didn't expect. I was fully prepared to sort of bounce off of this. I really don't like puritanical texts. I really like when people go into theology and that aspect of Holy Scripture and like angelology and like very certain aspects of theology are very interesting to me, but overall, religion as organized religion in particular and the daily activities of that, I would expect to bounce off of, but yet didn't. The characters are very steeped in personality. They're interesting, fun. They react in very dynamic ways. The history of the place is elucidated very organically, and her own trajectory as becoming somebody of importance, ostensibly in history. I don't know if this is completely fictional or what, is very compelling and cool. She's just a neat person. She's very flawed. She is pretty like ruthless sometimes. Like you get a lot of respect for her in a like, I don't know, like a gladiatorial way or something, right? Like she can mess people up, and you wouldn't do that, but respect kind of deal. She takes on enemies in very like dynamic ways, I guess I would say again, and there's a component where she receives sort of like visions and you don't know if they're real or not. There is a question as to if she gets these visions to influence the outcome of the things that she wants, because she knows that the other nuns and stuff like that are influenced by the fact that she has visions, right? She must be very pious, she's getting visions. Or is she actually getting visions, right? Like, is she, you know, the egg or the hen, right? Like, what came first? Is she the person who has agency, or is God? Or is both happening at some points? Who knows? It's very interesting. I thought it was compelling just if the story had been that, but there's so much more going on, and yet it's short. She is exceptional at cutting to the chase, unlike that other book where time is very granular. This is like, you know, it'll be sands of time and then suddenly it'll jump like years in the future and stuff. She's very good at knowing what is of interest and getting exactly to that. She doesn't waste your time. There's not a space spared. So overall, I gave it 4 stars. Definitely a book that I would recommend. Again, it's kind of missing like the X Factor type deal for 5-star reads. And I look forward to Fates and Furies, I believe it's what it's called, because I have that book actually already, and it's waiting in the wings. As for what I'm reading now, I have started House of Leaves with Sina, and I'll do a actual separate video on this because I have a lot to say of it already. I have a lot of theories. I really love it. It's freaking me out a little bit. Not as much as I expected, but in the very beginning it really freaked me out. But the more that I've sort of interacted with the meta aspects of it, it's sort of tempered that, which is nice. Unless it fumbles the ball somehow, I expect that when we are done this in mid-January, I believe, it will probably be a 5-star read, in the same way that usually when I'm reading something, I can tell if something is going to be 5 stars or not very early on. And then for Cloak and Dagger Christmas, I'm also just starting Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This was excellent so far. I'm on page 47. I've seen The Handmaiden before, so I kind of know what's going to happen, but this is set in Britain, and the prose are incredible. I really like her flow. Her delivery is very like lyrical. The diction is something I'm not familiar with because it's like Victorian times, but it is so precise in its deployment and intuitive in the like uncanniness, to me, I guess, way of the prose, that it's just like really fun to consume. Even if it's a word that I'm not aware of, I can generally guess what it is meaning in the sentence's use, and it is usually like a fun word, like something that gets people who are into diction interested in the word, if that makes sense. And the setup is really fun so far. It's about a girl who grows up in a home where the woman raises kids, like farming kids, which is weird. She takes care of kids and then I guess sells them to people, right? Like as a labor force or something. And everybody in her household is a grifter of some kind. She grows up and a guy named Gentleman is proposing this wild heist to her in which she needs to learn how to be a maid for like a proper woman. And then they are going to convince an heiress to marry Gentleman, and then he is going to take her money and abscond and put her in a mental institution, apparently. So these are not good people, yet it's very fun to read from the prose. So we'll see how I land on it, but so far this is also seeming like it'll be like a 4-star read so far. And that's it. Let me know what you're reading, what you're enjoying, if you've read House of Leaves, and if you've read Fingersmith. I'd love to know what you thought of them or any of the books that I talked about. And otherwise, I will see you next week. Bye.